Welcome back, everyone, to the Asheville Vedic Astrology YouTube channel, youtube.com/Ryan's Vedic Astrology. I'm here today with a familiar face, a student from the Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship Program and graduate, practicing astrologer, Sachin Sharma. He is a wonderful astrologer, very thoughtful, and I know you've seen him on this channel before. And today we're going to talk about some aspects of Jungian psychology and how it affects our understanding of astrology, as well as how it can impact or have some kind of influence on our understanding of prediction within astrology. So thank you for being here, Sachin. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So as we're getting started today, what we wanted to kind of explore was this idea of the personal equation. So for those people who are not familiar with this idea or Jung's work as it relates to this, how would you describe that?
So, personal equation in the modern contemporary form is often spoken of as style. That's not my style, or like my client must not. I have a style of doing things. So you develop a style over time. You focus on certain areas. You start specializing. But from a Jungian perspective, it's something deeper. It's about the experience of the analyst, or in our case, the astrologer, with their own unconscious. So their own personal equation in that way. What's their subjective experience? How much have they worked on themselves internally? And it's this personal equation that we have with our own unconscious. And then this idea can be opened up in various ways. What's the personal equation of the client with their own unconscious, yours with your own unconscious, your unconscious with the client's unconscious? So that's your birth chart and their birth chart. So karmically, right now, as we speak, your unconscious, which is unconscious, I'm using in the term of we are unconscious of our karmic material of our birth chart. So your birth chart relating to my birth chart, and my birth chart relating to yours, and are these two psychic realities, these two selves, coming together in this space-time continuum. So the both birth charts aligning in a way, which is this personal equation.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying in a way that the astrologer's birth chart or their underlying karmic influences and the client's underlying karmic influences, that we should probably take these into consideration so that there is a beneficial exchange between the two?
Yeah, exactly. And that one of a simpler way to understand would be what's your, at least as an analyst, as an astrologer who is doing interpretation, who is doing judgment, what's their level of self-awareness? How much are they aware of their own solar system, of their own soul system? And that is, I think, something that is not available right now. We haven't even thought about it much. One thing that I really want to emphasize also is that we are in astrology where psychology, especially psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, was in late 1800s or early 1900s. So what I mean by that is, if I can take a few moments to explain that, what I mean by that is that if an analyst, if a person went to a therapist, their analyst, they would be like, they come with a sense of mistrust, like, prove to me that therapy works, prove to me, which now in the 21st century is it, of course it works. Like, I just need to find the right therapist.
Right.
And when a client comes to an astrologer, they come with this idea of, I don't believe in astrology, or I just believe in it. I don't know what it actually is. I haven't experienced it. It's not a fact. It's a matter of belief for me. And so prove to me that it works. Predict for me. I want to be fascinated. It's a matter of fascination, exploration of this sort of It's still a very fantastical sort of world. So we are exactly 100 years what psychotherapy, psychoanalysis was 100 years ago in astrology today.
Yes, I mean that makes some good sense, especially if we consider the movement of the yugas and the time cycles and our continued deepening of understanding of what astrology is about. I mean, why has there been such a explosion in different kinds of astrology or different approaches to astrology, or even kind of questioning ways of doing astrology? It's like it's indicating that we are in a time where there is a lot of opportunity for development, certainly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let's take this into kind of a practical side so people can understand it. Um, are are you kind of implying or indicating that in order for astrology to work really well for clients, um, the astrologer themselves needs to have like a really deep understanding of themselves? And I'm just curious, do you think that would come about through astrology, or do you think that would come about better through like engaging in actual psychoanalysis with someone who's been trained in that field?
Both. It would come through psychoanalytic astrology. And that's something that would develop in the next 100 years. And the thing is that the basic thing that we need to understand is that the astrologer needs to confront their own birth chart on a day-to-day basis. They need to confront, and they need to confront it in the objectivity is not so accessible, because we are sort of initially we are sort of the fish in the water. So and you ask, one fish asks the other fish about the existence of the water, and they're like, where's water? It's like how we try to look for God. And it's like that. We don't have that objectivity. And as we develop in our practice, I remember from my own experience, when I started studying, I would see something, and there's a lot of wishful thinking that comes into play. Like, you want to believe a certain thing, you're expecting a certain relationship to work out, and you start looking at Venus a certain way, and you want the transit to be a certain way. And it's only later on, when I studied with you, with Ernst, that I realized, apart from the personal equation, there's this objective truth to astrology. But that access, one's ego complex, just ego, needs to be developed enough to handle that truth, to be able to confront the birth chart and be like, okay, this particular dasha will start at this particular age, and these planets are completely, as Ernst would say, trashed. And because they're trashed, how are you going to deal with that fact? What are you going to do for that? And for this, the East, especially India, had techniques. It had real techniques to deal with this problem. The West, especially the academia, especially the modern West scientific psychoanalytic realm of things, doesn't have, when they go to that layer of unconscious, when they access things like that, when they access, for them it would be a premonition in a dream. They don't know how to deal with that. For us, it's a matter of fact through astrology. Premonition is not a matter of fascination. It's like, yeah, of course, like things happen, destiny is taken as a fact rather than a fascination.
Right. I'm not sure if you're taking it in this direction or not. You can clarify, but it sounds like, on one level, one of the things that we talked about in the Asheville Vedic Astrology apprenticeship program was this idea that tell the truth as you see it. And for example, if you're looking at someone's chart and they want to know about their relationships, and you don't see anything about relationships in there, you can say, I don't see it, because that's the truth of the matter. Or on the other side of it, it might be that one doesn't have an answer, meaning you've done the research and you just don't know. So in a way, the astrologer, his or herself, needs to kind of face that reality that they may or may not see things, rather than tapping into their own subconscious need to either please the client or have a false belief that something like astrology can fix everything. And in the same way, what you're describing about the client themselves, and this has been an issue that I've seen happen a lot in astrology, is maybe you're looking at a chart and someone's writing you or asking you questions about their career or their relationships or children or finances, and it's just not there, meaning the support isn't there. We can say it's trashed, or we can simply say it's just not there. And so from the perspective I hear you saying is from this Indian paradigm, ideally the client or the person who's getting the astrological reading ideally has the strength and the capacity to say, okay, this must not be my path. So now, coming at it from a healthy perspective, I'm going to adjust my expectations, and I'm going to try to live in a way that my life is meaningful, even though the gift of a relationship isn't that strong for me. What other areas of my life can I explore in that regard? Did I take this in a direction that you weren't meaning to go in?
Yes, definitely. It definitely touches upon a deep subtlety, and there's a lot to unpack there. The multiple layers, like for instance, it'll be both. Like the person, if there's a truth of a situation, the astrologer should have at least a certain idea, like how much of this truth can this person handle. Before that, the point that I'm trying to make is that has the astrologer dealt with the truth of their own situation?
Okay.
And that's the personal equation. And the final point would be that we sort of meet our destiny on the road we choose to avoid. And that was one of the things that Jung said. And I think it's really profound because so there are three layers of conversation happening at the same time. There's one stream of thought, which is astrology is coming from a perspective of fixing, controlling the future, knowing the future, navigating it. They keep using, it's a map, you can navigate, you need to fix things, don't do this, do that. It's very prescriptive and remedial. Do a remedy, do an upay, and then things will get fixed. But it's about observance, attention, awareness. Sun is the center. It's the planet of becoming aware of your karmic stuff, merits and not to change it. Because change would mean a desire, which would lead to all sorts of confusions. Because what if you, in your current paradigm, ego thinks that this is a good thing to avoid, but it shouldn't be avoided because it has to lead to something else. So we can't. Our processors can't handle that much. We have like a very low RAM. And our processor is like a Pentium, old, like one of those old Windows. We're running a very old software unless we start to meditate and improve our consciousness, evolve our consciousness, and we process more, improve our intellect also. So that's the one stream that astrology is about: observance, awareness, and not fixing. It's about knowing your structure first, your metaphysical structure. Fixing and all comes eventually. It's there somewhere. And the point that I'm trying to make is that since the main issue is the personal equation issue, that why did Jung and I'm not like Jung had his own shortcomings and stuff. Like out of all the Europeans who invaded the Indian psyche and tried to misinterpret the let's say Indian spirituality to civilize the primitive savages. That's how they perceived us, like literally all the letters and everything. When you read Indology from the European aspect from 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, especially Germans started it. And you see that, okay, they saw us as primitive savages who can't interpret their own culture and they need to be saved. So Christianity was like, okay, we need to save them, we need to appropriate it. And they brought in this whole Abrahamic way of thinking. So out of all the offenders, I feel Jung is the least offensive to me and the most compatible with Jyotish. He's the most compatible with Jyotish and the least offensive. And from that, when we take one of his concepts of personal equation, because in his own, you can call it self-absorption, he contemplated the nature of the psyche really well. And in that contemplation of nature of the psyche, we are contemplating basically the moon, which is manas. So we are focusing on manasic uh, uh, structure of things, like how we perceive the duality of things, relativities, like, okay, everything ends up splitting and everything goes on a spectrum suddenly. It's a non-dual space. It's a dualistic space when you perceive things through the moon. And from that perspective, the personal equation is that since there's no matter how much the objectivity of the birth chart is available, there is always a wielder of the weapon. There's always a person who's wielding the sword. Astrology being the sword, the wielder of the weapon is the astrologer. And that's the personal hand that is holding it. And the strength of the wrist, the structure of the hand, the intellect behind it, the character development behind it, the amount of self-reflection, shadow work, complexes the person has thing, the kind of attachment the person forms based on the attachment theory, like what kind of, how do they find, what kind of anxiety patterns do they have? All of those things would go on the session. And be it predictive, be it counseling more so, predictive can be. We can create some sort of conceptualization about it. And because again, you're predicting, there'll be a bias. Like if you have repressed rage, then you'd predict all sorts of like I've had clients who come like with, and I'm sure like everyone who's watching right now, and I'm sure you also have had so many traumatized people who come traumatized from astrology. They've been told they're going to die. They've been told, recently someone told me that their sister's astrologer told them that she's going to kill herself in 2 years. And so responsibility and accountability is zero in the world of astrology currently, especially like in all astrology, New Age astrology, especially, even all astrology. Like I've had clients who were told like the left arm would get chopped off. There's one who was told their first child's gonna die, and it wasn't gonna. Like it's not even that. There is some truth to it. Like when I actually assess the chart, nothing of that sort's gonna happen, but due to whatever repressed issues, whatever owned, the personal equation again comes into play. Whatever they haven't dealt with, whatever they haven't confronted within themselves, their religious beliefs, what's their relationship to God? How do they, is God a punisher for them, or is God a compassionate being? And punishment comes from a certain other sort of phenomenon, which is something else other than God. I don't know what's the philosophical grounding of the astrologer, or what's the psychological self-awareness of the astrologer, and what's the actual math and science of astrology that they've learned, right? So there are multiple layers. There's the philosophical aspect, there's a psychological aspect, which is how much have they worked with their own psyche, philosophical aspect, which is how do they think about things, and the math and science, like what do they know about astronomy, how do they, what kind of system are they using, uh, of system of astrology are they using certain things which came out of, as we would know, as we would, especially since we subscribe to Sri Yukteswar Giri's yoga cycle model, if the texts arose from the medieval times, they're ascribing to that sort of thing, like yeah, so that I think is something so difficult right now, because this is the same as these psychotherapists there's a recollection of in Jung's writings where Jung writes people speak about psychotherapy as if it's like cold water therapy, and like really that's how astrology is right now. It's in a tarot like domain, and I absolutely like have I don't know how to say it in the most politically correct way, but I have absolutely no respect for tarot as such, right? So I mean, I can just flip a couple of pages out of a book, random book, and like if I know how to weave meaning and speak metaphorically and judge the situation, if I have that sort of intuitive insight, I can use anything. Omenology is basically tarot,
Right.
which is nimitta and stuff in India. So that essence is so critical, for me, like that and another problem is that we don't have the structure right now. Like, who, as an astrologer, who do I go to who sort of uses the same astrological methods as me, is psychoanalytically, psychologically aware, and can help me get an objective perspective, whom I can trust?
Right. Right.
So
Well,
this,
that's the hard part. And we
yeah,
again talked about this in the apprenticeship program, where we would discuss how if you're going to work with a client and you are not a psychotherapist, or you've not been trained in counseling psychology, your job is not to be a counselor in that way, because you don't have the skills, the training to understand how to actually reach the person. But like you're saying, if you do have a good system, then you can share information that ideally is more accurate. But that's the difficulty that I hear you saying there, is that the problem is we can have a good system, but the person wielding that system might not have been trained in a way that is actually using that system in a helpful way. So the problem is,
yeah.
where do we find people that are good counselors, that are good astrologers, that have also done a level of self-development? And that's like requiring that the person be a yogi, that the person has gone through counseling, that the person
And it
studied,
is.
and that's hard to find.
It's exactly that, and that's the work that's the foundations of that work is being laid out through all the efforts that you're putting.
Mm-hmm.
The foundation you've created, people like me and all the students, and so that's the foundational work that you're doing. Like you bringing up Kriya Yoga, which is like uh, the most logical thing to do. Like the
Right.
moment you study astrology and like, okay, Atman, there's an Atman, and there's, okay, that means like that's the next logical conclusion for me to sit and meditate.
Mm-hmm.
So
But
this sort of thing.
even in that, the difficulty that I have, while I've got experience with Kriya Yoga and astrology, yes, I got my undergraduate in psychology, but I'm not trained as a counselor. I've never gone to school to explore methods of really helping a person in that way. So even in that situation, that's why I think in a community effort needs to be there to help make this possible.
Yeah, that's true. And that's the thing. Like that's another frustration that I had like over the past couple of years with myself also. Like the moment an astrology, like I'm an astrologer means nothing. That's like I know maths. Okay, there's a sun, Venus, moon, and they look at each other in this way. And how are you going to use it? Are you going to use it in your financial markets? Are you going to use it in what way is it going to be applied? What's the applied astrology of it? And the moment you are in a session, the moment someone says, I want to leave my partner, you're in the counseling domain.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, you need we need to have the basics in place. Like we need to know some basics of counseling. And there are some brilliant books which all counselors and these therapists, even though they go through like many years of training and stuff, some of them become really brilliant, but most of them are quite lost. They're as lost as the astrologer who doesn't know counseling.
Right. That goes back to your idea of the personal equation and understanding that ahead of
Yeah,
time.
yeah, because we have the astrology, they have the therapy, the psychology of it, and that's where they both, and that's the effort with bringing Jung into the picture to therapize Jyotisha in a way that is helpful, and why our our man Jung is like compatible with Jyotisha in that way. And you know, that's the thing. Again, some basics like being trauma informed. So not like just knowing like some basics about what would it feel like, okay, if I look at the first, one of the key rules that everyone's watching should know is that always check the first 3 years of Dasha and judge the planet there. Just know what happened, what kind of situation was this person was in the first 3 years. If you can't figure it out, speak to the person about it. Like, ask them like, what did they get? The mother's milk? Did they get that attachment, complete attachment? What was the relationship? How was the family? Were you moving? What kind of situation? And just be informed like how much that impacts the rest of your life. So basics, like some basics, bare bones of psychology need to be known. And then astrology is so powerful that you can tell so much more and create such a nice narrative and such a good structure for the other person. And I've been doing this work with various clients where I'm in a depth analysis with them and guiding them over multiple sessions to access their unconscious, to give them decent interpretations, to not just give them, but like have them get involved in the process with me to interpret the chart as a third party and not being as me as an, and that all, so this personal equation also weaves into the idea of transference and countertransference.
Okay.
So
say more about
that's so that would be the moment. And what's the client's relationship to astrology? Like, how do they perceive astrologers? Are they divine gurus? Are they scammers? Because when they enter, they project that on you, and that affects the session. And what's your relationship with astrology? Do you see yourself as this super powerful person and I know everything? Like initially, like a lot of astrologers go through this phase of arrogance and this pedestal that they feel they're on, like, because it's a, if someone knows a few techniques, they feel, and people respect you, especially in India and stuff, like you become this person who decides other people's fate. That's a big problem. It's like you decide like how the person's going to get married, whom they're going to get married to. Every family in India has a family astrologer. Most families do. And then they make these judgments and they don't let the destiny unfold. They intervene. What is the repercussions of that on the astrologer's soul, karmically? These things are so subtle.
Right.
And that's the problem with subtle arts. Like it's so subtle that and that's where the therapist, the analyst was the guru. That's where the guru doesn't need to know astrology and stuff. They know the planetary influences. Many gurus have spoken about it. They know these things. They know much more than that. They're in touch with your causal body and what all the subtle stuff. And then we have the whole guru trauma now ongoing and being reinforced by all sorts of nonsensical documentaries and all sorts of nonsense on the internet about gurus and like the word guru being tainted and misinterpreted by the West and even the East, where they use it as financial guru or like anyone who's just who knows something is just master of something is just guru. But it was such a subtle tradition. So that's where the personal equation of the analyst, the astrologer, and their unconscious, they could tap in with the meditation, with the astrological knowledge, with the philosophical knowledge, which was so profound in and of itself. But the guru could assist the process, and they could, whenever they get stuck or get stopped somewhere, wherever they could access the guru to get unblocked there.
Right. I mean, that makes good sense. I was actually just we had talked earlier before we got started about the holy science and looking into more of the Sanskrit. And at the very end of chapter 1 of the holy science, Sri Yukteswar mentions that essentially the most important thing one can have is a Satguru, someone who can serve that role for them. And one of the things I was writing about is, well, how do you find that? How do you even prepare yourself for that? Because as you mentioned, with the advent of the internet and other things, it's easy for someone to play a role and act as though they've got that capacity, and then you might find out they don't. And the individuals that do have that capacity are rare. So I guess my question to you is, from your perspective, how would you advise someone who's listening to this to hear what we're saying and hear, in a sense, the state of affairs that we're in, but what should one do, or what could one do to help move in the direction of having a relationship with an astrologer, or having a relationship with a guru, or having a relationship with someone that can really help them, as well as what can one do oneself to be not just open, but also discerning about how to kind of find or proceed towards that kind of experience or relationship? It's a big question, I know.
Yeah, yeah, and that's, but it's quite find the deeper the student, the more honest the student in you, the better your teachers. I remember when I was just an asshole student of astrology, my teachers were the same. And so
That's great.
the deeper I got into my own the more humble and the more honest I became about learning, the more sincere became such a massive word. When I used to write emails to you, when I used the word sincerely, when I used to sign off and just type sincerely, that meant a lot to me. Like, it was like so sincere. I was like, it's just so much for me, like a martial artist. It's kind of such a sort of like that level of like dedication. So, and there were so many instances even while learning astrology, with the apprenticeship, the whole apprenticeship years, were there were times when I was like absolutely hammered, like wrecked in some way in life. And I would write it out. I would be like, this is what happened this time, and I made it. I did it. And that gave me a sense of, it built my character. And that's really important. The so there's that one layer where you find that honest student and access whatever guru is available to you, which can be a book, which can be astrology, which can be whatever is heavier in knowledge, as we say, because Jupiter being the guru, it means heavy. So whoever is heavier than you, in Sanskrit we use the word gurutva for gravity, which means Gurutva means the things, the heavier things that attract other things because of the heaviness. So because they're heavy, they bend space, and because they bend, things attract towards them.
Right.
So we, even for gravity, we use that. So gravity of the situation is that being honest that way, and then you see, like, you develop, like, you start with things like cognitive behavior therapy, and you just access physical therapy first. You just get in touch with your body, with your lagna, astrologically speaking, and lagna lord, just stretching, feeling the muscles and stuff, and then slowly accessing a deeper aspect of you, and then another layer, and the deeper layer, and then you become psychological in nature, and then you find a deeper layers of being, and unravels, and then the right teacher enters whichever stage you're in. That, and then on another hand, we have, what is your, like, is guru word a trigger word, and why has it become a trigger word? And if it has, then clearing that off, because that would just create so many resistances to, you wouldn't even be able to use a book like, let's say, Atomic Habits as your guru properly, because just having a teacher in and of itself would just create so many resistance. And then that comes into your personal equation, where you need to learn about your ninth house, your Jupiter, your Venus,
Right.
Brahmin planets, and you're like, okay, why is my ninth house like this? And sometimes you'd be just so stuck. You'd be like, that's all I've got. Like, my ninth house lord is just, let's say, with Rahu and Saturn. And there's this, and I'm running Rahu and Saturn Dasha. So I have this whole block. Let's say Rahu, Saturn, Moon in the ninth. This is something so intense. And in those moments, you need access to things like Kriya Yoga, I guess. Like that cleansing, the psychic, Jung called it psychic hygiene, I think he used the word.
Yeah.
So to create that energetic karmic hygiene, to like have a solid technique which cleans the drains of your nadis and your everything.
Right.
And that, yeah, so that would be the other aspect.
Yeah, and you kind of answered this question that came up. The idea was with that idea of sincerity, I think that's good. But also, what I was wondering about was once you have the sincerity, well, you also need discernment because you can be sincere, but at least my personal equation shows that you can be as sincere as you want, but there are plenty of people out there which might want to capitalize on that.
Yeah.
Right. And my own experience and kind of what you're saying here is by doing behavioral counseling or other kinds of things, coming more in tune with yourself, in a way, your discernment can become stronger because the healthier you are psychologically, the less apt you are to put yourself in situations where you're going to be taken advantage of or you're going to have yourself harmed, which again, in my mind, is why I think the yamas and the yamas are so important to practice, and even those divine qualities in chapter 16 of the Bhagavad Gita, because if you are cultivating those, you have to be psychologically healthy to express them. Because if you experience fear, well, fear is it's necessary. If someone bursts into my room with a gun, it would make sense for my body to be afraid. But if I'm always going around being perpetually afraid of someone jumping into the room with a gun, when I've never actually experienced that in my entire life, fortunately, that is not that I'm not being fearless because of a psychological issue. So by cultivating the psychological well-being, it promotes discernment. Could we say that that's kind of where you were going with that? Does that?
Yeah, exactly. So discernment is so important because see, even quite sincere. They're so sincere. Like they are like one of the best students, you can say. Like if you just tune up their discernment, they are peaking for enlightenment, let's say. Like they're so sincere. They're so literal in their stuff. Physicists, like intellectuals working at a very high capacity are quite sincere. Like you just redirect their attention and they're so ready for like this thing. But discernment is so discernment in an unevolved state, it feels like doubt. And when doubt gets refined, it turns into discernment, and then it becomes more refined and more refined and more refined as your consciousness evolves, and to the point where you can just I don't want to use the word intuit because it's being misused a lot, but it's I think we can use it since I've mentioned that it's been misused a lot. But you can just intuit, you just get a hunch, a feeling, and then it's rooted in a certain analysis, and then you access a way of discerning the truth of the matter beyond the thinking mind.
Yeah.
And that comes from it doesn't come from logic. It's beyond logic, and it comes from unconscious space, but becoming conscious of a very unconscious space, like let's say we can call it the atman, or some sort of chitta, so that it stays so that the Buddhists stay comfortable. Since we use the word atman, Buddhists become very uncomfortable these days. But let's call it chitta, bodhi, some sort of evolution of the subtle mind. So there uh, that doubt needs to be cultivated. Cultivation of the doubt will turn into discernment. We are being told things like don't doubt. Like doubt is your enemy. Skepticism is your enemy. Unevolving unevolved states of skepticism is Sri Yukteswar Giri emphasized a lot on the use of logic. And so one example could be, one of the very common examples used to teach logic is, where there's smoke, there's fire. And then you move closer. That's your first. Then you move closer and then you see, oh, it was steam. So there was smoky stuff, but it was actually steam, and there was no fire. It was just water boiling, but there was fire because there was a sun.
Mm-hmm.
So you sort of like follow through. The water boiled because of the heat of the sun, and then there was the steam coming out. So there was actually, so logically it was correct. So you can like tune into that doubt. But doubt, if it's like a resistance, but not true doubt, and then that would again need a sort of discernment.
Right.
So there's this subtle underlying thing, which is discernment, but they're just, I would say it's a spectrum and they're levels and it evolves. And even like animals have a discernment. Like you give a certain kind of food and they wouldn't eat. Like they know, they can discern. And then we need to make a very clear distinction between the word discernment and discrimination. Mm-hmm. These are also confused so often, because discrimination is to know that this is a pencil and that is a pen. That's discrimination. Discernment is that I need to write with a pencil because I need to erase this. I might need to erase this later. Mm-hmm. That's discernment. So discriminate it and then discern like how to use it, right? And it can feel like, and then discrimination turns, doubt turns to discernment, and discernment turns into wisdom. That's the highest sort of level. And that wisdom is what we used to call gyan, or some sort of inner knowing. We don't know how to capture the essence of wisdom, but it's just and that it's very simple. It comes to very simple parables, fables, and stuff. And
right,
you
like
can,
the idea of coming upon a rope and it looks like a snake, but it's really just a rope. But you can't tell people who think it's a snake. You have to show them, or they have to find out for themselves, I suppose. These kinds of things. Yeah,
that kind of thing. Exactly.
Well, one other idea that I think might be helpful for our listeners to consider with this idea of the personal equation. You had mentioned the moon earlier, and I think that's a good reference point, because let's say, for example, we see someone with, as you mentioned, maybe Moon and Rahu and Saturn together. And we know through some Logitati Avashtas, even if we just consider Saturn and the moon together, that's going to make a person prone to focusing on what could go wrong, or the more difficult things. And so if you see that, if the astrologer has the awareness to see that within a person's chart, they also need to have the awareness to know how to speak to that so that they don't trigger that moon Saturn issue. And so I guess my question to you is, what would you recommend for people to do to get a better sense of their moon and more objectivity about how their moon functions, so that they're more discerning or more discriminative of the kinds of people they work with, the astrologers they work with?
Yeah. So moon's general characteristics, Saturn's general understanding, getting the knowledge of these two separately and then together. And then you have to, like, ideally, I wouldn't seek a relationship counselor who has never dated anyone, right? So it's a very basic thing. Like, we have all of these counselors who are experts on all kinds of things, and they haven't like really experienced stuff. So we have like young astrology. I mean, the wisdom is not having to experience something and being able to speak of it. Like, so it's both sides, but it's just better if someone has gone through the experience itself, or at least touched it, or have had someone around them who've gone through the experience. So ideally, someone an astrologer who has certain difficult combinations in their own birth chart, and not this astrologer who's like just like chilling in life, smoking, drinking, partying, and like has a rich lifestyle. And then you come with this deep, sorrowful state, and you're like, when I was 8 years old, this sort of thing. And you're like, okay, they were running Saturn moon, and you're like, see, you just have to get over it, man.
Yeah.
And that's the perspective that person, because they just get over it. They just have a drink, drive a nice car, and they
Right.
just get over it. Right.
Well,
So
it reminds me of the opposite of that. When I had first begun practicing astrology, I remember I was working with one client, and the client was absolutely distraught. And they told me their problem. And their problem was they only made $800,000 last year, and they didn't make 1.2 million like they're used to. And me having absolutely no concept of that much money, I couldn't speak to them because I thought, really, you're complaining about the fact you only made $800,000. But if I was wiser and clearer, I would have had an understanding that for them, based on their understanding of life, that is a painful thing, and it needs to be addressed in that way for their own well-being.
yeah, exactly that. So
Yeah.
that sort of attunement, of course, from a developed perspective, you'd think one would think that okay, 800,000 is a lot of money for anyone in this world. But then you have to speak to that. You have to come to their subjective reality. And
Mhm.
this is what Jung also emphasized on, and he used to call it the psychic reality of the client. So sometimes it's just about so discerning, like when the client just wants to tell you something, just being like, okay. So one of the key things with Jung was he said confession is very important. So he really he was really Christian in that sense, and I think confession really like takes off the psychic pressure, and there are moments, and astrologers don't allow this space often because they just have to speak. Okay, start talking about me. So astrology is, if you have to just come back to a starting point, is where psychoanalysis, just therapeutic psychology was in the late 1800s or early 1900s, where someone would walk into your this thing, and you have to demonstrate. You have to be a sort of a monkey for them. Like, okay, like I can do these tricks for you. Are you entertained? And like, huh, I'm sort of entertained. I just find a new astrologer who can tell me good things about me, especially in a narcissistic culture, which is like uh, this sort of self-absorption. So from that perspective, people are just seeking validation, seeking answers that they already have. Like they just want a validation of those answers from something like astrology, because whatever relationship they have with astrology. So these things need to be uprooted through more dialogue about the actual nature of astrology. Its place is not in the newspaper. Its place is not in the magazine. Its place is not um, in crystal work. Its place is not in this new age therapies. Its place is in an ashram with a guru. It's very profound. It can lead to deep realization of the metaphysical structure of reality. And through that realization, your discernment improves. You can see things clearly as to how this reality is being structured through, and it's not universal, it's solar system based. So there can be another solar system where there are 5 Saturns and people are suffering all the time. 5 Saturn-like planets, and there can be systems where there are 20 Jupiters and people are just overtly overfed, extremely fat, and just they just so much fruit that it's rotting. Let's call it that, because Jupiter rules over fruit-bearing trees. So too much of a good thing, too much of a bad thing, where people are just constantly seeking spirituality because there's 10 Saturns there. So the world is so starved that they need something beyond. So Saturn can, my subtle uh, pointing at is that Saturn starvation can be a good thing. It leads to a lot of seeking and searching. Like, so that brings us to that little point that you had made about Saturn Moon conjunction and how that moon starvation makes the person often appreciate the little things, because any little bit of water, when you're thirsty, even a little bit of water feels, you really feel the water. And you meet these people with Jupiter Moon conjunctions, and life's always been really good. And you'll find them complaining about things like, I had $1.2 million last year, and this year I only have 800,000. So it's very relative. It's very a judgment, good, bad. And that's the beauty of Hinduism. That's the beauty of Hinduism. It doesn't talk about good and bad and saving. It talks about dilemmas. It talks about goodness and badness. It talks more good than that, less bad than that. It always talks about relativities. And Swami Vivekananda, just to add one last point, Swami Vivekananda translated the word Maya not as illusion, but as relativity.
Oh, that's very nice. Yes.
It's so profound. It just hits the mark for me, at least.
Excellent. That's lovely. So we're going to have to draw to a conclusion here. I wish we could speak a little bit longer. It seems like there's so much more we could say. But before we conclude, is there anything that you would like to encourage our listeners to do, to explore, or think about for themselves?
Just confront your own birth chart as honestly as possible, and develop that ego and develop that strength of the ego to bear the truths of reality. The nature of existence as a place of duality, pain, pleasure, and everything, and just contemplate as deeply as possible, and just be very discerning with your astrologer and question them. Don't feel powerless. Question them to the core, about everything. And if they're a true astrologer, and if they've thought about things really deeply, if they've actually solved problems in their life, then they won't get triggered or agitated. They'll have the mettle to bear with your question. They'll actually be excited if it's a challenging question, but always come with humility, not with offense to the astrologer, because that's just being a bad human being.
Well, thank you for being with us today. This is
Thank you so
Sachin
much.
Sharma, and his website is searchinsachin.com. I'll put a link to it in this video, but also in the description. He's well worth contacting for a Vedic astrological session. As I mentioned, and as he had said, he is a graduate of the Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship Program. And I do believe, are you working with students in that program now as a mentor or tutor, or was that just a one-off that I had heard?
It was just a one-off. Like I have one student that I'm working with right now.
Okay, well, never mind then. Don't contact him for mentorship or tutoring at this time. But
no, it's not a one-off in that sense. Like, please contact me. I would love to get
okay.
Yeah, it was just first one. That's what I understood from that. It's my first student who recently contacted, and we started learning. But I'm really open to a sincere student and guide them through the mentorship. It's amazing. It's really helpful.
Excellent. Well, good. Yes. And I've always appreciated Sachin's work. I can remember reading many of his papers, and he is extremely thorough. We'll just say that. I can remember many a time reading his papers, and there was a 3,000 or 10,000 word limit, and I get 30,000 words. so he is a hard worker. But anyway, it was a pleasure to see you today, and I look forward to doing more. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.